You wake up. It's the year 1247. You don't know that yet. Obviously, you're still half asleep. And the first thing you notice is that something smells absolutely terrible. That something might be you. It might be the straw you're lying on. It might be the goat standing 3 feet from your face. Honestly, at this point, it's probably all three. You sit up, you look around, and then, before you even think about breakfast, before you think about the goat, before you think about literally anything else, you have to get dressed. And here's the thing, getting dressed in medieval Europe was not the mindless 5-minute routine you know today. It wasn't a quick scroll through your closet while half watching something on your phone. Getting dressed in the Middle Ages was a loaded act. What you wore told everyone around you, instantly, unmistakably, exactly who you were, where you came from, how much money you had, what God thought of you, and whether you were the kind of person who got to eat the good bread, or the kind of person who made the good bread, and then watched other people eat it. Your clothes were your identity, your social passport, your resume, your warning label. And if you wore the wrong thing, if you showed up dressed above your station, if you, a humble miller, dared to put on a fur-lined cloak like some kind of wannabe nobleman, you weren't just committing a fashion crime. You were, in the eyes of medieval society, committing something close to a crime against God and nature itself. Because in the medieval worldview, the universe was ordered. Everything had its place. The king was at the top, the peasant was at the bottom, and the clothes were the visual proof that everyone was exactly where God intended them to be. So yes, getting dressed was serious business, but it was also, if we're being completely honest, frequently ridiculous. We're talking about a 1,000-year period, roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, spanning dozens of cultures, hundreds of subcultures, and fashion trends that range from quietly practical to what on earth were they thinking? Pointed shoes so long they had to be tied to the knee. Headwear that defied both gravity and good taste. Sleeves so wide they dragged along the floor and occasionally caught fire. A period in which some people were legally required to wear badges, identifying them as Jewish, or as prostitutes, or as lepers, because even your marginalization had a dress code. This is the story of medieval clothing, not just what people wore, but why. Not just the gorgeous, illuminated manuscript version of the Middle Ages, the knights in gleaming armor, the ladies in flowing gowns, but the full, sweaty, itchy, flea-ridden, occasionally breathtaking reality. We're going to start from the bottom, the literal bottom of the social pyramid. We're going to talk about what it was made of, the actual raw materials, because before you can understand why someone wore something, you have to understand what it cost to make it and how brutally hard it was to produce. Then we're going to climb rung by rung from the peasant in his scratchy wool tunic all the way up to the king drowning in his ermine, and we're going to look at every layer, literally and figuratively, in between. By the end of this, you'll understand why a medieval peasant wore the same basic outfit his great-great-grandfather wore, while a 14th century French noblewoman was caught up in a fashion arms race so intense it bankrupted families and triggered actual government legislation trying to slow it down. You'll understand why color was power, why fur was status, why the length of your sleeves, the height of your hat, and the pointedness of your shoes could, in the right context, be a political statement. And you'll understand why, despite all the differences between then and now, people in the Middle Ages, just like you, just like everyone, looked at what they were wearing and thought about what it said about them. What story it told, whether it was the right story. Some things, it turns out, never change. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The fabric of society. What clothes were actually made of. Let's start with a question that sounds simple, but absolutely is not. Where did medieval clothing come from? Not in the existential sense, in the very literal, very physical sense. Before a single stitch was sewn, before any garment existed at all, someone, usually multiple someones, usually working extremely hard for very little reward, had to produce the raw material. And the raw materials available in medieval Europe shaped everything. They determined what people could wear, who could wear it, and at what cost. So, raw materials, you've basically got four big ones: wool, linen, silk, and cotton. And the story of each one tells you something essential about medieval society. Wool is where we start, because wool is the great democratizer, or rather the great common denominator. Almost everyone in medieval Europe wore wool. The peasant in his field wore wool. The monk in his cell wore wool. The knight wore wool under his armor. The noblewoman wore wool, just finer wool, more expensively dyed, with better tailoring. Wool was everywhere, because sheep were everywhere. Sheep in medieval Europe were basically walking textile factories, and people treated them accordingly. The wool industry was the economic backbone of England, Flanders, and large swaths of Italy. English wool in particular was so prized across Europe that it became a cornerstone of England's foreign policy and trade relationships. The phrase "born in the wool," meaning something fundamental, something that goes all the way through, comes from the dyeing process, where you could dye wool at the fiber stage so the color went all the way through every strand. That's how central wool was to medieval life. It worked its way into the language. But here's what most people don't appreciate. Wool is not just wool. There is an enormous range of quality. At the low end, you've got coarse, scratchy wool from lower quality sheep. The kind of stuff a peasant could afford. The kind of stuff that would have you itching through your entire workday. At the high end, you've got fine merino-type wools. The Spanish merino sheep became incredibly important later in the medieval period. Beautifully smooth, soft enough to wear directly against skin without wanting to tear your skin off. And in between, you've got dozens of gradations, each with its own price point, each signaling something about the person wearing it. Processing wool into cloth was an industry unto itself, and an incredibly labor-intensive one. You started with shearing the sheep, straightforward enough. Then the raw fleece had to be cleaned, which meant washing out the lanolin and dirt, a smelly and unpleasant process. Then it had to be carded or combed, dragging the fibers through toothed implements to align them, then spun into thread, historically mostly by women, using a drop spindle, or later in the medieval period, a spinning wheel, then woven on a loom, then often fulled, pounded in water, and sometimes urine, because medieval textile workers were nothing if not creative and pragmatic, to felt the fibers together slightly and strengthen the cloth, then perhaps napped, the surface raised with teasels to create a fuzzy texture, then shorn smooth, then dyed if you could afford dye. By the time a piece of wool cloth was finished, it had passed through dozens of hands and hundreds of hours of labor. This is why cloth was expensive. This is why in medieval wills, people left specific garments to specific people. Your good wool cloak wasn't just a cloak, it was a significant asset. Linen is the second major textile, and it's different from wool in almost every way that matters. Linen comes from flax, a plant with beautiful blue flowers that conceals a frustrating secret. Getting usable fiber out of it is a genuinely horrible process. You have to ret the flax, soak it in water, or lay it on damp grass for weeks to rot away the outer plant material. This process smells spectacular in the worst possible way. Then you have to break the stems with a tool called a flax break, then scutch them, beat them, then hackle them, comb them through fine metal teeth to separate the long line fibers from the short toe fibers, then spin them, then weave them. The result, if you've done everything right, is a fiber that is smooth, cool against the skin, and, crucially, can be washed repeatedly without deteriorating. This made linen perfect for underclothes, the layer worn directly against the skin, the layer that absorbed sweat and body oil, the layer that could and should be washed regularly, even when the outer wool garments were not. The tunic or shirt worn as the Innermost layer throughout most of the Middle Ages was almost universally linen. The chemise, a woman's undergarment, was linen. Bed sheets for anyone who could afford them were linen. Your tablecloth was linen. The altar cloth in the church was linen. It was simultaneously intimate and sacred, which tells you something interesting about the medieval relationship with cloth. Linen also had a social dimension. The fineness of your linen was a marker of status. A peasant wore rough linen, maybe not even particularly well processed, with a slightly grayish or brownish natural color. A noblewoman wore linen so fine it was nearly translucent. In portraits and illuminated manuscripts, you can sometimes see the fine white linen of a woman's chemise peeking out at the neckline or wrists, and that visible sliver of high-quality white linen was itself a status signal. It said, "I can afford good underclothes. I am clean. I am refined." Then there's silk. Oh, silk. If wool is the common language of medieval textiles, silk is the language of power. Silk is extraordinary in almost every objective sense. It has a natural sheen. It drapes beautifully. It takes dye in a way that produces the most vivid, saturated colors imaginable. And it's remarkably strong for its weight. It also, for most of the medieval period in Western Europe, had to travel an absurd distance to get there. Silk production was centered in China, and later Byzantium and the Islamic world. Getting silk to France or England meant months of overland travel along the Silk Road, or maritime routes around the Arab world, with merchants and middlemen taking their cut at every stage. By the time a bolt of Chinese silk reached Paris, it had changed hands dozens of times and cost an amount that a typical peasant family could not earn in years of labor. This is why silk garments were essentially exclusively aristocratic for most of the Middle Ages. Silk wasn't just expensive, it was exotically, almost incomprehensibly expensive. A single silk gown could represent the annual income of a small estate. Kings and queens wore silk. The church used silk for vestments. Great lords wore silk on special occasions. Everyone else looked at silk and dreamed. Later in the medieval period, from around the 12th and 13th centuries onward, Italian city-states, particularly Lucca and later Florence and Venice, began producing their own silk textiles, using production techniques gradually acquired from Byzantine sources. This made silk somewhat more available, and it slowly filtered down to wealthier merchants. But it remained a luxury throughout the period we're discussing, and governments repeatedly tried to legislate who was and wasn't allowed to wear it. Cotton is the interesting outlier. In the early medieval period, cotton was largely unknown in Western Europe. It was a fabric of the Islamic world and India. Contact through trade and the Crusades gradually brought cotton into European awareness, and by the later Middle Ages, a cotton-linen blend called fustian was being produced in parts of Italy and Germany. But cotton never achieved the dominance it would later have. It remained relatively rare and somewhat exotic in medieval Western Europe. Your medieval peasant was not wearing cotton. Beyond these main four, there were other materials doing important supporting work. Felt, made by mattering wool fibers together without spinning or weaving, was used for hats and some other items. Leather was crucial for belts, shoes, gloves, and some outer garments, particularly for working people and soldiers. Fur was perhaps the most visually dramatic textile in medieval Europe, and we'll talk about fur a great deal when we get to the aristocracy, because fur was not just warm. Fur was a statement, a performance, an entire social code in itself. And then there's dye, because the color of your clothing was as important as the fabric itself. Producing color in medieval Europe was expensive, technically demanding, and, for some colors, genuinely extraordinary. The most prestigious dye, by a very wide margin, was a deep crimson red, produced from a scale insect called kermes, found on oak trees in the Mediterranean. Kermes dye produced a color so rich, so stable, and so beautiful that it became synonymous with wealth and power. Cardinals wore it. Kings wore it. The word crimson itself is etymologically related to the word for this insect. Even more expensive by the later Middle Ages was scarlet, which was initially not a color but a type of very high quality, finely finished wool cloth, so expensive that it was almost always dyed a rich red with kermes, and eventually the word scarlet transferred from the cloth to the color itself. Blue was produced primarily from woad, a plant grown across Europe, and later increasingly from indigo, which had to be imported from Asia, but produced a superior, more intense color. In the 13th century, the woad-growing regions of France were among the wealthiest agricultural areas on the continent because woad was essential to the textile industry. The color blue went through an interesting social journey. It was associated with the Virgin Mary's robes in religious art, which gave it a kind of sacred prestige, and by the later medieval period it had become fashionable and prestigious among the nobility, even rivaling red. Yellow and green were easier to produce and therefore less prestigious. There were multiple plant sources for both. Black, surprisingly, was difficult. Getting a truly deep, stable black dye that didn't fade to brown or green required significant skill and expensive mordants, the chemicals that fixed dye to fiber. A truly deep, rich black was therefore also a marker of status. Think of the wealthy merchants of 15th century Flemish portraits, dressed in their jet black robes. Purple, specifically the imperial purple derived from sea snails called murex, was so expensive and so associated with the Byzantine imperial court that it was essentially off-limits for Western European nobility by social convention. The phrase "born to the purple," meaning royalty, comes from this tradition. Western European rulers mostly looked at actual Byzantine imperial purple from a respectful distance. White and undyed natural colors, the creamy off-white of unbleached wool, the gray-brown of natural linen, were common not just because they were cheap, but because some religious orders deliberately chose undyed habits as a sign of humility. The Cistercian monks famously wore undyed wool habits, a visible rejection of worldly luxury. And then there was the matter of who was forced to wear particular colors, or symbols not as a luxury, but as a mark of marginalization. In many medieval cities, Jews were required by law to wear distinctive badges, a yellow circle or a piece of yellow cloth, making them identifiable at a glance. In some areas, prostitutes were required to wear a striped hood or a particular color. Lepers, when they entered towns, had to ring bells and wear distinctive clothing to warn people away. The same system that used fine silk and crimson dye to elevate the powerful also used sumptuary marks to humiliate and control the vulnerable. The cloth, in other words, was never neutral. It was always speaking. And now that we know what it was made of and what it cost, now that we understand the system, let's go meet the people wearing it. Let's start, as all things in medieval society ultimately started, from the bottom. Chapter 2. The Peasant's Wardrobe. Dressing at the bottom of the food chain. You are a peasant. Specifically, you are a male peasant in rural England, sometime around the year 1150. You own, let's be generous, perhaps a few acres of land. You have a wife, several children, an ox if you're doing well, a few chickens, and a relentless awareness of exactly how much grain you owe your lord at harvest time. You wake up every morning before dawn because the work doesn't wait, and every morning you put on basically the same thing. Let's describe it. Your innermost layer is a linen tunic, called a bray for the lower body, specifically. Think of a loose, roughly knee-length shirt worn directly against your skin. It's not quite white, more of a natural off-white, maybe slightly grayish, because true white requires bleaching in the sun. And frankly, you've had better things to do with your time than make your underwear presentable. This is the garment that gets washed, sort of sometimes, in cold river water with whatever passed for soap, because it's in direct contact with your skin, and even medieval people understood that accumulating too much filth too close to your body was not ideal. You've also got a rough linen or wool cloth wrapped around your lower half as basic underpants, the brays proper, sometimes tied around the waist with a drawstring. Over the linen tunic, you're wearing your main garment, a wool tunic. This one sits somewhere between knee length and calf length. Practical because you need to move. It's belted at the waist with a strip of leather, both because it looks better that way, and because the belt is where you hang the various small tools and pouches you need throughout the day. The sleeves come to your wrists. The neck opening is a simple slit, maybe with a small clasp or tie at the top. The color of this tunic? Almost certainly some shade of brown, gray, or muddy green. Not because peasants had no aesthetic sense, but because these are the colors you get when you use cheap, locally available plant dyes on undyed wool, or when you use no dye at all and work with the natural color of the fleece. Some of those natural browns and tawny colors were actually produced deliberately using cheap tannin-based dyes from oak galls or tree bark. The fabric itself, let's be clear about this, is not comfortable by modern standards. It is not soft. It is the kind of wool that would make a 21st century person immediately want to put something else on underneath it. But you've worn it your whole life, and your skin has long since made its peace with it. You barely notice anymore. Your legs are covered by hose. Wool stockings, essentially, cut on the bias, diagonally to the weave, so they stretch somewhat and conform to your leg. They're tied up to your brace, or possibly held up by garters tied just below the knee. They're not like modern tights. They're more like two individual leg coverings, and there's a gap between them at the top that your tunic covers. This was fine in a world where everyone dressed and undressed in front of everyone else, and nobody found it remarkable. On your feet, shoes, probably simple turn shoe, construction leather shoes, made by sewing the leather inside out and then turning it right side out, creating a shoe with no exterior seam. They're not particularly waterproof. Your feet are frequently wet. You've made peace with this too. If it's cold, and in medieval England, it is cold for a significant portion of the year, you've got a cloak, just a large rectangle or semicircle of wool, fastened at the shoulder with a pin or a simple brooch. In genuinely awful weather, you pull the hood up. You do have a hood. It might be attached to the cloak, or it might be a separate item called a coif, a simple linen cap that ties under the chin. For outdoor work in the rain, you might have a hood with a short shoulder cape attached, called a capuchon, which is the ancestor of the word cap. And that's it. That's the peasant's wardrobe. Variations exist. Summer means lighter layers, winter means more layers, and possibly some rough fur. Trim on the cloak if you can afford it, but the basic picture stays the same year after year, generation after generation. Now let's talk about your wife, because her wardrobe follows the same basic logic, but looks somewhat different. A peasant woman wears a linen chemise as her base layer, functionally similar to a man's inner tunic, but typically longer, reaching to her ankles or feet. Over that, she wears a wool gown, a loose, long-sleeved dress that reaches to the ground, again belted at the waist. She might wear an additional shorter tunic or surcoat over this on cold days. Her head is covered, almost always, because for a married woman in medieval society, bare hair in public was considered immodest, even inappropriate. She wears a linen coif or wimple, fabric wrapped around the head and under the chin, or simply a cloth draped over her head. Unmarried girls might wear their hair loose or braided, but once you were married, the head covering went on and largely stayed on. She's also wearing an apron or smock over everything when she works, because the work she's doing, cooking over an open fire, feeding animals, working in the garden, processing flax or wool for spinning, is dirty work, and at least one layer can be sacrificed to protecting everything underneath. Her shoes are similar to her husband's. Her hose are similar. Her cloak is similar. The main visual differences between a male and female peasant from a distance are the length of the outer garment and the head covering. One thing worth noting, we often imagine medieval peasants as wearing rags, genuinely falling apart, barely held together rags. And while it's true that the medieval poor had very few garments and wore them until they couldn't be worn anymore, patching, repatching, and repatching again, the actual archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that most working peasants had functional, serviceable clothing. Not fine clothing, not fashionable clothing, but clothing that did its job. The truly destitute, beggars, vagrants, the genuinely desperately poor, wore rags. Most, peasants, wore rough but intact working clothes. This matters because it pushes back against the simplistic picture of the Middle Ages as uniformly miserable. Life was hard, clothing was not luxurious, but there was craft and care in even humble garments. The wool had to be processed, the thread had to be spun, the cloth had to be woven, and that represented real skill and real labor. A peasant woman who produced cloth was doing highly skilled work, even if it was entirely unrecognized as such by the economic and social structures of the time. Now, what changes as you move slightly up the peasant hierarchy? Because peasant covers a lot of ground. At the absolute bottom, you've got serfs bound to the land with minimal legal rights and minimal resources. Slightly above them are free peasants who own their land outright or hold it on favorable terms. Above them are the more prosperous yeoman farmers. The differences in their clothing were real, but subtle. More money meant slightly better quality wool, smoother, finer, better processed. It meant more garments, perhaps a good outer garment kept specifically for church attendance and important occasions, different from the everyday work tunic. It meant the possibility of some dye, some color, a decent brown or a muted blue-green. It meant shoes that fit better and lasted longer. It meant, perhaps, a small brooch or pin of base metal. Not silver, not gold, but something. A decorative touch. A human desire to look a little better than purely functional. Because here's the thing about people. All people, across all of history, they care about how they look. Even in circumstances of very limited resources, people find ways to add small personal touches to their appearance. A ribbon braided into a daughter's hair. A particular way of folding or draping a garment. A small embroidery at the hem of a tunic. The impulse to beautify and individualize is as old as clothing itself. But the peasant's freedom to express that impulse was constrained not just by economics, but by law. And here is where things get genuinely interesting. And more than a little telling about how medieval society worked. Beginning around the 13th century in England and elsewhere in Europe, governments began passing what are called sumptuary laws, literally laws about consumption, specifically about who was allowed to wear what. These laws weren't subtle. They spelled out, in legal language, exactly which fabrics, which colors, which furs, and which ornaments were permitted to which classes of people. England's sumptuary legislation in 1363, passed during the reign of Edward III, is a particularly clear example. The law divided English society into distinct categories and prescribed exactly what each category could wear. Laborers and servants were restricted to blanket cloth, a rough, cheap wool, and linen with no gold, silver, silk, or embroidery. Artisans and craftspeople got slightly more options. Merchants below a certain income level were restricted. Esquires and gentlemen got more. Knights and their families got even more. And so on up the pyramid. Why bother? Why did governments care whether a successful merchant wore silk trim on his tunic? Several reasons. First, the straightforward economic argument. Expensive foreign textiles were luxury imports, and the nobility didn't love watching commoners buy up luxury goods that might otherwise fund noble households. Second, the moral argument. Luxury and excess were considered spiritually corrupting for everyone, but especially for those of lower station, who were considered less equipped to handle the temptations of luxury. Third, and most honestly, the visual argument. In a world without identity documents, without photographs, without the bureaucratic apparatus of the modern state, your clothes were how people identified what you were. If successful merchants dressed like knights, and knights dressed like lords, the entire visual system of social hierarchy broke down. Society became literally illegible. Medieval authorities found this genuinely alarming. They believed in a divinely ordered world, a world where God had placed each person in their proper station and where that station was meant to be visible. Clothing that misrepresented your station wasn't just a fashion crime. It was, in a very real sense, a lie about the order of the universe. Did the laws work? Mostly spectacularly, no. They were passed repeatedly, which tells you they were violated repeatedly. A prosperous 14th century merchant who had worked hard, made money, and wanted to wear a fur-lined cloak was not reliably deterred by legislation. The laws were enforced inconsistently, depended heavily on local circumstances, and were in constant tension with the economic reality that if someone could afford to buy something, there was usually someone willing to sell it to them. But they tell us something important. The anxiety about social boundaries was real. The desire to keep clothing as a reliable signal of social position was real. And the fact that the laws had to be passed at all tells us that people at the lower end of the spectrum were, whenever they could manage it, dressing up. Which brings us naturally to the people who occupied the middle, the people who had money, who wanted to dress up, and who occupied the genuinely awkward social position of being economically successful, but not nobly born. Chapter 3. The merchant class. When you have money, but no title. Picture this. You're a wool merchant in 14th century London. Your grandfather was a shepherd. Your father traded in raw wool. You, through a combination of hard work, good timing, sharp instincts, and possibly a little creative accounting in your ledger books, have made yourself genuinely wealthy. You own a house, a nice house, with actual glazed windows. You employ several workers. You have business contacts in Bruges and Florence. You eat meat more days than not. And yet, every time you walk down the street and see a minor nobleman's son, a young man who has never done a day of productive work in his life, who lives off his father's estate, who contributes to the economy approximately nothing, dressed in a beautiful scarlet wool surcoat with silver buttons and a fur-trimmed cloak, you feel something. Something complicated. Something that the sumptuary legislation specifically exists to address, because that feeling, multiplied across thousands of successful merchants across Europe, was a genuine social force. The merchant class, what historians often call the bourgeoisie, from the French bourg, meaning town, occupies a fascinating and genuinely awkward position in the history of medieval clothing. They had the money. They did not have the birth. And these two things were, in the medieval worldview, not supposed to be separable. In the early medieval period, this tension was less acute because merchant wealth was less substantial and less visible. But from roughly the 12th century onward, as trade networks expanded, as cities grew, as banking and credit instruments developed, as the Italian city-states rose to economic dominance, the merchant class became richer, more numerous, more confident, and increasingly resistant to being told what they could and couldn't wear. What did a wealthy merchant actually wear? Let's dress one up properly. Start, as always, from the inside. A fine linen chemise, not the rough linen of a peasant, but genuinely fine linen. Well bleached to white, smooth against the skin. This is the foundation. Over the chemise, a fine wool tunic, but here the wool is of a quality the peasant could not afford, close woven and napped smooth, in a color produced by quality dye. A good strong blue perhaps, a deep brownish red, a rich green. The dyeing of this fabric alone represents a significant expense. Over the tunic, a surcoat, an additional outer garment, either sleeveless or with short sleeves, that adds another layer both of warmth and of visual interest. By the 14th century, fashionable surcoats were being cut in increasingly creative ways, fitted more closely to the body than the earlier loose tunic silhouette. Around the waist, a proper belt. Not a strip of rough leather, but a well-made leather belt with metal fittings. Maybe even silver fittings if you can get away with it before the sumptuary laws come for you. Hanging from the belt, a purse, a visible sign of having money to put in it. Perhaps a small knife in a decorative sheath. On the legs, fine wool hose, fitted and well made, in a solid color that complements the tunic. On the feet, proper leather shoes, well fitted, possibly with pointed toes, because pointed toes were fashionable, and fashionable was what you were going for. Over everything, a cloak or robe of quality wool. And here, you're pushing boundaries, because you've had your cloak trimmed with a modest amount of fur. Not ermine, that's reserved for royalty and high nobility by custom and law. Not sable, too expensive and too conspicuous. But perhaps squirrel, specifically miniver, the white winter belly fur of the Eurasian red squirrel, worked into a modest lining or trim. Respectable, warm, subtly expensive. On your head, a hat. Hat fashion in the merchant class was a particular area of expression because the sumptuary laws were less clear about headwear than about garments. A quality felt hat, a hood in fashionable colors, a more elaborate arrangement as fashions evolved toward the later medieval period. And here's what's interesting about the merchant look, taken as a whole. It's aspirational, it's upward reaching. Every element is chosen to signal prosperity, respectability, and carefully pushing the limits of what's legally and socially acceptable. Gentility. The merchant is not dressing to look like himself. He's dressing to look like the person he wants to be, or the person he wants to be mistaken for, or at least to close the visual gap between himself and the nobility as much as possible without getting hauled before a magistrate. This is, of course, also a statement about his wife. Merchant wives were important symbols of their husband's success. They were one of the primary ways a merchant demonstrated his prosperity to the world. And so merchant wives were very often dressed at the absolute limit of what sumptuary law permitted for their class, and sometimes somewhat beyond it. A wealthy merchant's wife might wear a gown in fashionable colors, with embroidered trim, with a fashionable headdress, with fine leather shoes. She wore her husband's success on her body. The church had opinions about this. The church had opinions about everything, but it had particularly pointed opinions about female vanity and the corrupting influence of fine clothing on women's souls. Preachers thundered from pulpits about women who dressed above their station, who spent their husband's money on vain ornaments, who prioritized appearance over piety. These sermons were so common, so repeated, and so specifically detailed about the fashions they were condemning that they've become one of our better sources for what people were actually wearing. Because if you want to know what was fashionable, read the sermons complaining about it. The merchant class also had a complicated relationship with professional guilds, and guilds sometimes had their own informal dress codes, certain garments or colors associated with particular crafts displayed on civic occasions. A goldsmith's guild appearing in a city procession would present itself very differently from a guild of weavers. Civic identity, professional identity, and personal display all overlapped in complicated ways. And this points to something broader about urban life and clothing in the later medieval period. Cities were engines of fashion. In a village, you knew everyone, and there was little point in performing status through clothing. Everyone already knew exactly what you had and what you were. In a city, you were surrounded by strangers, and those strangers judged you instantly on what they could see, which meant that clothing as social performance was most intense, most competitive, and most creative in urban environments. The great commercial cities of medieval Europe, London, Paris, Bruges, Florence, Venice, Cologne, were the places where fashion changed fastest, where new silhouettes appeared first, where merchants competed visually with nobility, and sometimes won, and where the sumptuary laws were most frequently tested and most frequently violated. Florence is perhaps the most fascinating case. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Florence was home to some of the wealthiest merchant families in Europe, people like the Medici, whose fortune derived from banking and commerce, not from hereditary land. These families were effectively more powerful than most nobles, and they dressed accordingly. Florentine fashion of the 14th and 15th centuries, visible in contemporary portraits and in meticulous inventory records kept by households, was sophisticated, colorful, and technically accomplished in a way that was simply not possible without serious money and serious access to the best textiles Europe produced. And yet Florence also passed sumptuary legislation repeatedly. Florence was, in some ways, the sumptuary law capital of Europe, passing new regulations every few years, as the previous ones were systematically ignored. The Florentine government fined women for wearing too many buttons. It restricted the length of trains on gowns. It limited the use of certain embroidery techniques. And Florentine women and their merchant husbands ignored the fines, paid them cheerfully when they were levied, and kept wearing exactly what they wanted. This tells you something quite important. By the later medieval period, in wealthy commercial cities, the old idea that clothing should reliably map to social position was breaking down. Not completely. The visual hierarchy still existed, and outright attempts to dress as royalty would still attract consequences. But the middle zone, where wealthy merchants dressed in ways indistinguishable from minor nobility, was large and getting larger. The clothes were becoming somewhat decoupled from the birth. This was, in the long view of history, the beginning of something. The commercial classes acquiring the trappings of aristocracy through purchase rather than birth was a slow-motion social revolution, playing out in silk and wool and fur over several centuries. The world where a merchant's son could dress like a gentleman, and people would, grudgingly, eventually, treat him like one was, very slowly coming into being. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about the people who were supposed to be at the top, the nobility, the knights, the royalty, we need to spend a little more time in the middle of the social spectrum with a group that had its own very specific and very fascinating relationship with clothing. We need to talk about the church. Chapter 4: God's wardrobe, priests, monks, and the politics of holy fashion. You are standing outside a cathedral. It's a Sunday morning, sometime around 1200, and the world around you is organizing itself the way it does every week. People streaming toward the church from every direction, dressed in whatever they've got, which ranges from respectable Sunday best to this is genuinely the only thing I own. And then the priest emerges. He is wearing white. Specifically, he's wearing a long, white linen garment called an alb, from the Latin alba, meaning white, that covers him from neck to feet. Over that, a colored vestment called a chasuble, draped over his shoulders and falling front and back, in a color that tells you exactly what moment in the liturgical year you're in. Purple for Advent and Lent, white for Christmas and Easter, red for Pentecost and the feasts of martyrs, green for ordinary time. The chasuble might be embroidered, possibly elaborately, possibly with gold thread, possibly with scenes from scripture worked in stitches so fine they look painted. Around his neck, a strip of cloth called a stole, another liturgical marker of his priestly authority. Around his waist, a cord or fabric belt called a cincture. On his hands, possibly liturgical gloves. On his head, depending on his rank and the occasion, various forms of headgear that signal exactly where he sits in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. He is, in short, dressed in a way that is entirely different from everyone around him. Not just differently expensive, differently structured, differently colored, differently symbolic. His clothing is not clothing in the ordinary sense. It is theology made visible. The church's relationship with clothing was, to put it gently, complicated, and that's being very generous. On one hand, the church was one of the primary drivers of sumptuary thinking, constantly preaching against vanity, luxury, and the corrupting influence of fine dress. On the other hand, the church itself was one of the most spectacular consumers of luxury textiles in medieval Europe. Cathedral treasuries were full of extraordinary silk vestments, gold-embroidered altar cloths, and jeweled liturgical accessories that would have made the most fashion-obsessed noblewoman's eyes water. This wasn't hypocrisy, exactly. Or at least, it wasn't understood as hypocrisy. The distinction the church drew was between dressing to glorify yourself and dressing to glorify God. A noblewoman who wore silk to show off her wealth was guilty of the sin of pride. A priest who wore silk vestments to honor the divine liturgy was performing an act of worship. The same fabric, worn for different reasons, had an entirely different moral valence. Whether you find this distinction persuasive probably depends on how charitable you're feeling toward medieval ecclesiastical logic. But the practical result was this: the church produced, commissioned, and wore some of the most extraordinary textile art in medieval European history, and it did so with a completely clear conscience. Let's talk about those vestments in more detail, because they're genuinely fascinating. The liturgical vestments worn by Western Catholic clergy during the medieval period were descended from the ordinary clothing of the late Roman world, specifically from Roman civil and ceremonial dress. But they had, by the medieval period, become entirely separate from everyday clothing. The alb was the base, that long white linen garment symbolizing purity and baptism. The amuts was a white linen cloth worn around the neck and shoulders, tucked under the alb. The stole, the long strip of fabric worn around the neck, was a marker of ordained status. Deacons wore it differently from priests, who wore it differently from bishops. The chasuble, the outer vestment worn for Mass, was the principal liturgical garment and the one that received the most elaborate decoration. Early chasubles were large, enveloping garments. Think of a full circle of fabric with a hole in the middle for the head, falling to the ankles all around. Over time, they were cut back at the sides for ease of movement, eventually becoming the smaller, more shield-shaped garments still worn today. But in their medieval form, they provided a large canvas for embroidery, and medieval embroiderers, many of them women working in religious houses or professional urban workshops, took extraordinary advantage of that canvas. English embroidery, known across Europe as opus Anglicanum, English work, was so prized that it commanded prices that rivaled or exceeded the most expensive silk textiles. Papal inventories from the 13th and 14th centuries list opus Anglicanum vestments as among their most valuable possessions. English embroiderers, working with silk thread, on silk or linen ground, often with gold thread couched in complex patterns, produced work of almost incomprehensible technical sophistication. Individual vestment sets took years to complete. They depicted figures of saints, scenes from the Passion, elaborate geometric and foliate patterns, all in stitches so fine they achieved effects that seemed more like painting than needlework. And this embroidery was made by people, mostly women, frequently working in workshop conditions that sound genuinely grueling. Accounts describe women working by lamplight, crouched over their frames, producing something of extraordinary beauty under conditions that were probably damaging to their eyesight and their posture. The glory of the finished vestment and the labor conditions of its production were, shall we say, not in close conversation. The bishop's vestments were even more elaborate than the priest's, and they added additional items. The mitre, the distinctive two-pointed hat that has become the universal symbol of episcopal office, developed gradually during the 11th and 12th centuries from earlier liturgical headgear, and became increasingly large and elaborate over time. The episcopal ring, a large gold ring worn over liturgical gloves, symbolizing the bishop's marriage to his diocese. The episcopal staff, or crozier, carried as a symbol of pastoral authority. An archbishop or cardinal added further layers of distinction, and the pope's vestments were in a category entirely their own. The most elaborate, most symbolic, most expensive liturgical dress in Christendom, the papal tiara, that extraordinary three-tiered crown, was a statement not just of religious authority, but of the pope's claim to authority over secular rulers as well. The triple crown represented, in various interpretations, the pope's jurisdiction over heaven, earth, and purgatory, or his authority over clergy, laity, and emperors. It was, in short, a hat that was making some very large claims, and it looked the part. All of this is the clothing of the secular clergy, the priests, bishops, and cardinals who operated in the world, serving parish communities, and filling the administrative and political roles of the institutional church. But the other major branch of medieval Christianity, the regular clergy, meaning monks and nuns living under a religious rule, had an entirely different relationship with clothing. one that was, in its own way, just as carefully coded and just as visually distinctive. The monastic habit, the distinctive clothing of monks and nuns, was not designed to impress. It was designed to do the opposite. The whole point of the habit was uniformity, simplicity, and the suppression of individual identity. When you entered a monastery or convent and received your habit, you were making a visible statement. I am giving up my individual self, my worldly identity, my social position, in order to belong entirely to God and this community. But even within this framework of deliberate visual sameness, there were enormous differences between orders, and those differences were themselves meaningful, themselves a form of religious communication to the outside world. The Benedictines, the oldest and most established of the major Western monastic orders, wore black habits. This was their default, their tradition, their visual identity. So much so that they became known simply as the Black Monks. Black, as we noted earlier, was actually a somewhat expensive color to produce well, but Benedictine monasteries were often wealthy institutions, and the uniformity and somber dignity of the black habit suited their identity as settled, stable, long-established communities. The Cistercians, who emerged in the late 11th century as a reform movement explicitly rejecting what they saw as the excessive comfort and luxury of Benedictine practice, chose undyed wool habits, giving them a white or grayish-white appearance, depending on the natural color of the local sheep. This was a very pointed visual statement. Undyed wool was the humblest possible choice. It said, "We are not spending money on dye. We are not engaging with the vanity of color. We are stripping away everything unnecessary and returning to raw simplicity." The Cistercians became known as the White Monks, and their undyed habits were paradoxically one of the most recognizable fashion choices in medieval Europe, a fashion of deliberate anti-fashion. The Franciscans, founded in the early 13th century by Francis of Assisi, a man who famously stripped off his expensive clothing in the public square of Assisi and walked away from his merchant family's wealth, wore rough brown or gray habits, coarse and plain, belted with a simple knotted rope. The Franciscan habit was the most radical visual statement of all. It was deliberately designed to look like the clothing of the very poorest people in society. Francis wanted his followers to look like beggars because he believed that identification with the poor was central to the Christian life. The Franciscan habit was, in a very real sense, a costume of poverty, chosen, not imposed, which gave it a very different meaning than the actual poverty of actual poor people. The Dominicans wore white habits with black cloaks, giving them a distinctive two-tone appearance. The Carmelites went through several iterations before settling on their characteristic brown habit with a white cloak. The Augustinians wore black. The Premonstratensians wore white. Any educated medieval person could identify a monk's order from his habit at 100 paces, which tells you that even in monastic culture, even in a context explicitly devoted to rejecting worldly vanity, clothing was doing complex semiotic work. Nuns followed similar patterns within their respective orders, but with some additional considerations. A nun's habit typically covered her completely, including her hair and much of her face. The wimple and veil that covered a nun's head served both religious purposes: modesty, the suppression of individual female beauty, and practical ones, identifying her as a religious woman, and therefore as someone to be treated with a certain respect. The taking of the veil was itself the central ceremony of a woman entering religious life. The habit was not just clothing, but the physical embodiment of her vows. The veil also created an interesting tension with the church's own anxieties about female appearance. On one hand, the church insisted that women cover their hair and dress modestly. Female beauty was a dangerous distraction, a source of temptation for men, and needed to be contained. On the other hand, the church also produced visual art in which the Virgin Mary was often depicted in rich blue garments, draped beautifully, an idealized femininity that was visually attractive even while being theologically chaste. The message sent to medieval women was, as usual, somewhat contradictory. One more element of ecclesiastical fashion deserves attention: because it connects the church's clothing practices back to the broader social world. The clothing of the clergy in their daily, non-liturgical lives. A parish priest, when not celebrating the Mass, wore everyday clothing, but clothing that should be, according to church regulations, sober, dark, modest, and distinguishable from lay clothing. The requirement that clergy dress distinctively in their everyday lives was frequently restated, which suggests it was frequently ignored. A wealthy abbot might dress in a manner that was uncomfortably close to a nobleman's attire. Fashionable young urban cleric might succumb to the same trends affecting everyone else in the city around him. Church councils repeatedly condemned clergy who wore party-colored fashionable clothing, who wore pointed shoes, who wore short tunics, who wore their hoods draped jauntily in the latest style. The clergy, in other words, were people, and people, even people who had theoretically dedicated themselves to lives of spiritual discipline, frequently wanted to wear things that looked good. This is both entirely understandable and, given the Church's position as the primary moral authority on clothing and vanity, somewhat entertaining. The tonsure, the shaved circle on the crown of a monk's or priest's head, was, if you think about it, the ultimate sumptuary marking. It couldn't be taken off. It couldn't be hidden, though some apparently tried. It was the Church literally writing its claim on your body. Your head itself was a form of clothing, the most permanent, possible visible signal of your identity and your belonging. The interplay between the Church's official clothing ideology, simplicity, modesty, hierarchy, expressed through sacred vestments, and the actual clothing behavior of clergy and religious, ranging from extraordinary liturgical luxury to determined monastic austerity, makes the ecclesiastical world one of the richest sites for understanding how medieval clothing worked. It shows that the tension between the ideal and the actual, between what clothing was supposed to say and what people actually used it to say, was present everywhere in medieval society, even in the institutions most committed to enforcing the rules. Now, let's leave the cloister and the cathedral. Let's step out onto the tournament ground, the battlefield, the great hall of the castle. Let's talk about knights. Chapter 5, the knight's closet, armor, heraldry, and what warriors actually wore. You are standing in a field somewhere in northern France. The year is 1242. The occasion is a tournament, a formal, organized, martial competition that is simultaneously a sporting event, a social gathering, a military training exercise, and one of the most elaborate fashion shows in medieval Europe. Around you, men in armor are preparing to fight, and they are spectacular, not in a purely functional way, although the armor is functional and the craft that went into making it is extraordinary. They are spectacular in the way a peacock is spectacular, in the way that only beings who are both extremely dangerous and extremely concerned with how they look can be spectacular. The knights and their attendants have spent as much time and money on the visual presentation as on the martial preparation. And in this context, those two things are not really separate. Let's talk about what a knight actually wore. From the inside out, because the layers here are particularly important, and because most popular depictions of medieval armor skip several of them. Start with the innermost layer, a linen shirt and brace, exactly like any other man of the period. Then over the linen, what's called an arming doublet or gambeson, a padded quilted garment, usually of linen or light wool, that serves multiple purposes. It's the padding that makes armor bearable to wear. Without it, metal directly on the body would be agonizing, and the shock transmission from blows would be much worse. It's also warm, which matters because metal armor in cold weather is essentially a very expensive refrigerator you're wearing on your body. And the arming doublet has specific points, small loops or ties sewn at strategic locations, where pieces of armor can be attached and secured. Over the arming doublet, depending on the period and the type of armor, you've got various combinations of mail and plate. In the early medieval period, mail, rings of iron or steel linked together in a flexible mesh, was the primary metallic defense. A full mail coat, called a hauberk, covering the body from neck to knee or calf, with sleeves to the wrists, and sometimes a mail coif, hood, for the head. Mail is remarkable stuff, genuinely flexible, genuinely effective against cutting weapons. But it's heavy. A full hauberk weighs roughly 15 kilograms. It doesn't protect against blunt force the way plate does, and it's extremely time-consuming to make. Each link has to be individually formed and connected. A full hauberk might contain tens of thousands of individual rings. By the 13th and 14th centuries, plate armor begins to supplement and eventually largely replace mail for well-equipped knights. Individual plates of steel protect the knees, the shins, the arms, the chest, first as separate additions over or under mail, then increasingly as full plate suits that cover the body in articulated steel. A full plate harness of the 15th century is an engineering marvel. The plates shaped to deflect blows, the joints designed to allow freedom of movement, the whole thing distributing weight across the body so that a fit man can move, fight, mount a horse, and even run in it, contrary to popular myth. And this armor is not plain, not for a wealthy knight, not for a great lord, not for a king. Tournament armor especially is decorated, etched with patterns, blued, chemically treated, to turn the steel a deep blue-black, gilded, fitted with elaborate crests and decorative elements. The visor on a great tournament helm might be shaped like a fantastical creature. The surfaces of the armor might be engraved with heraldic symbols, religious motifs, or scenes from courtly romance. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, produced by specialist armorers who were among the most skilled metalworkers in Europe. But here's what really makes the knight's appearance extraordinary from a cultural standpoint, and this is where clothing and visual identity merge completely. Heraldry. Heraldry is one of the most fascinating systems of visual communication ever developed, and it arose directly from the practical problem of identifying knights on the battlefield and in the tournament. Because when a man is covered head to toe in metal, you can't see his face. You need another way to know who he is. The solution, which developed in Europe during the 12th century, was to assign each knight a unique combination of colors and symbols. His arms, which would be displayed on his shield, his surcoat, the fabric garment worn over armor, his horse's trappings, and his banner. Once you knew a knight's arms, you could identify him instantly from a distance, even in the chaos of battle. The surcoat, that fabric garment worn over the armor, is where heraldry was most visibly displayed on the knight's person. It was typically a simple, loose, sleeveless, or short-sleeved garment split at the bottom for ease of movement on horseback, made in the knight's heraldic colors and bearing his heraldic device. If a knight's arms were gules, a lion rampant, or red with a golden lion rearing up, his surcoat would be red with a golden lion on the front. The visual vocabulary of heraldry developed its own specialized language, literally, because heraldic descriptions use a technical terminology derived from Norman French that is its own complete system. Colors in heraldry are called tinctures and have specific names: gules, red; azure, blue; sable, black; or gold, argent, silver, vert, green. The shapes and symbols on shields are called charges. The way a charge is positioned has a specific term. An animal facing right, from the viewer's perspective, is dexter. Facing left is sinister. An animal walking is peasant. Rearing up is rampant. Sitting is séant. This is not just a technical vocabulary for its own sake. It's a precise descriptive language that allows a herald, a specialist in identifying and recording coats of arms, to describe any shield unambiguously in a standardized way. Azure, a bend, or describes a blue shield with a diagonal gold stripe, and that description applies to exactly one family's arms. No other family could legitimately use those arms. The principle of unique arms was enforced, somewhat inconsistently, but genuinely, by the system of heraldic authority that developed in the later medieval period. In England, the heralds and eventually the College of Arms kept records of who bore what arms. Disputes over heraldic rights were taken seriously and could end up in court. The famous case of Scrope versus Grosvenor, a dispute over the right to bear azure, a bend or ran for years in the late 14th century. and involved testimony from hundreds of witnesses, including Geoffrey Chaucer. Why did this matter so much? Because in a world where identity was visual and largely hereditary, your coat of arms was your family's visual identity. Passed from father to son, modified slightly by younger sons and cadet branches, accumulated and displayed as a record of lineage and alliances. A great nobleman's heraldic achievements, the combination of his arms with crests, supporters, mottos, and other elements, told the story of his family going back generations. Arms were displayed everywhere in a noble household, carved in stone over doorways, painted on walls, embroidered on furnishings, worked into stained glass. They appeared on seals used to authenticate documents. They marked the knight's equipment, his shields, his horse's caparison, the decorative cloth covering, his banners. They appeared on his tomb when he died. They were, in the most literal sense, how his identity was permanently encoded and publicly displayed, and the tournament was the great theater of heraldic display. A major tournament of the 13th or 14th century was a visual spectacular. Dozens or hundreds of knights in their heraldic colors, attended by squires and servants in matching liveries, their horses covered in embroidered cloth, their banners flying, their armor gleaming. Heralds stood at the entry to the lists, the tournament field, and announced each participant's arms in the formal heraldic language. The audience, which included the highest levels of noble society, including ladies whose favor the knights were competing partly to win, read the heraldic display as fluently as we read text. Ladies deserve special mention in the tournament context because the convention of courtly love, the elaborate cultural game in which knights dedicated their martial performances to noble ladies, received tokens of their favor, and competed in their honor, made women's clothing part of the tournament aesthetic in a specific way. A lady's token, a ribbon, a veil, a sleeve, yes, a sleeve, detached from her dress and tied to a knight's lance or helm, was a visible marker of patronage and connection. The lady's clothing was itself part of the heraldic performance. Off the tournament ground, the knight's everyday clothing was considerably more practical, but still socially significant. When not in armor, a knight wore clothing that reflected his noble status. Fine wool garments, fashionable cut, quality fur trim. In the later medieval period especially, fashionable noblemen's clothing became increasingly fitted and increasingly bold, in ways that sometimes alarmed social commentators. The silhouette of men's clothing changed dramatically in the 14th century. Earlier medieval men's clothing had been relatively loose, tunics and robes that fell straight from shoulder to hem, sometimes belted, but not closely fitted. Then, beginning roughly in the 1340s and 1350s, something changed. Men's clothing, particularly the clothing of young noble and wealthy men, began to be cut close to the body. Tunics grew shorter, sometimes scandalously short by earlier standards, reaching barely to the thigh. Sleeves became fitted to the arm. The body's shape was displayed rather than concealed. This is a genuinely significant shift in the history of Western fashion, and historians are still debating exactly why it happened when it did. New tailoring techniques allowed cloth to be cut and shaped to fit the body more precisely. The development of curved seams and careful piecing made a fitted silhouette achievable in ways it hadn't been before, but technical possibility doesn't fully explain cultural adoption. Something changed about what men wanted to display, about what body display meant in noble culture. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Moralists complained that short tunics were immodest, revealing the shape of men's legs and lower bodies in ways that were inappropriate. Chroniclers complained that young men looked like they were wearing women's short tunics. The church complained, older generations complained, and young fashionable men kept wearing their short doublets, their fitted hose, their pointed shoes, and largely did not care. The shoes deserve particular mention because medieval pointed shoes are one of those fashion choices that seem in retrospect both inexplicable and somehow inevitable. The fashion for elongated pointed toes, called poulaines or krakows, the latter name, suggesting, possibly unfairly, a Polish origin. Developed in the early 14th century and became increasingly extreme over the course of that century and into the 15th. By the peak of the fashion, the toes of fashionable shoes extended absurdly beyond the actual toes, sometimes by several inches, sometimes by a foot or more, for the most extreme examples. There are accounts of the points being stuffed with moss or wool to hold their shape, of the points being tied up to the wearer's knee with small chains to keep them from flopping about, of men having genuine difficulty walking quickly. The longer the point, in general, the higher the status, because only someone who didn't have to actually work or walk long distances could wear shoes this impractical. The pointed shoe was, in its own way, the ultimate sumptuary statement. I am so far above the need for functional footwear that I can wear footwear that barely functions at all. The English actually passed legislation in 1463 attempting to restrict the length of shoe points by social class. Knights could have longer points than esquires, esquires longer than commoners, and so on. Whether this had any practical effect on actual shoe points is unclear. Fashion, in the later medieval period, was increasingly resistant to legislation. The knight's helmet also evolved through the medieval period in ways that are worth noting, because the helmet was simultaneously the most important piece of protective equipment and the most elaborate canvas for decorative display. The great helm of the early medieval period, a flat-topped cylinder of metal that completely enclosed the head, gave way over time to increasingly sophisticated designs. The visored bassinet of the 14th century, the sallet and armet of the 15th. Each design balanced protection with visibility and ease of breathing, and each was decorated according to the owner's means and taste. The crest worn on top of the helmet was perhaps the most theatrical element of a knight's armored appearance, a three-dimensional heraldic device, often made of carved and painted wood or boiled leather, sometimes of real feathers, sometimes of elaborate fabric-covered constructions, mounted on top of the helm and rising above it. Tournament crests became increasingly elaborate and fantastic. Animals, mythological creatures, architectural elements, abstract shapes. They served no protective function whatsoever. They were pure theater, which, in the end, is a fitting note on which to end this chapter, because the entire martial aesthetic of the medieval knight, from the heraldic surcoat to the decorative armor to the elaborate crest, was theater. Not fake. The violence was real. The protection was necessary. The skill was genuine. But the presentation, the visual performance of knightly identity, was as carefully staged and as socially communicative as any costume in any other context we've discussed. The knight needed to be seen, needed to be recognized, needed to communicate his identity, his lineage, his allegiances, his worth, instantly, visually, unmistakably. Clothing, armor, and heraldry were all part of the same system. The knight was, in a very real sense, wearing his identity on his body, in the most literal way possible. Now let's go higher. Let's go to the very top. Let's go to the great halls of Europe's nobility, the counts and dukes and kings and queens, and see what happens when social power, artistic ambition, political calculation, and frankly, unlimited financial resources combine in the question of what to wear. Chapter 6, The Noble and Royal Wardrobe. When fashion becomes power. You have arrived at court. Specifically, you have arrived at the court of the French king, sometime in the mid-14th century, and the hall you are standing in is staggering. The ceiling is high and painted. The walls are hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes in dozens of colors, vivid blues and reds and greens and golds. Candles and torches cast everything in warm, dancing light. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, sits the king, and the king, to put it plainly, is wearing an astonishing amount of money. The first thing you notice is the color. Deep, saturated, almost unnatural crimson. A red so rich and so vivid it seems to generate its own light. This is high-quality Kermes-dyed wool of the finest grade, and it alone represents an expense most people in the room will never come close to in their lifetimes. Over this, a shorter garment, and you can see at the hem and cuffs that it's lined in white fur, the small black-tipped tails visible at regular intervals along the edge. This is ermine, the winter coat of the stoat, and in the medieval visual code, ermine means one thing and one thing only: royalty. The pattern of white fur with regular black spots, historically the actual tails, later reproduced in embroidery and painting, was so exclusively royal that it became the visual shorthand for kingship itself. Ermine in a coat of arms means royalty. Ermine in a garment means you are looking at someone very close to the top of the pyramid, or at the top itself. On his head, a crown. Not a helmet, not a coronet, but a crown. Specifically, one of the more elaborate pieces of goldsmithing you are ever likely to see outside of a cathedral treasury. Gold, set with colored gemstones. Rubies, sapphires, emeralds, alternating with pearls, rising in points or fleur-de-lis from a circlet, probably lined inside with more ermine. The king's shoes are visible beneath his robe, and they are pointedly pointed. His belt and the fittings of his purse are gold. The ring on his finger is gold with a significant stone. Everything is signal. Everything is deliberate. There is not a single element of his appearance that is not doing specific political and social work. Welcome to noble and royal fashion. To understand how the high nobility dressed in the medieval period, you first have to understand what noble and royal wardrobes actually were, because they were not closets in the modern sense. They were institutions. Great medieval noble households had officials specifically responsible for clothing. The English royal household had a wardrobe, which was originally, quite literally, a room where clothes were kept, but which became over time a full administrative department managing the monarch's personal finances and possessions. The accounts of the royal wardrobe record, in sometimes extraordinary detail, exactly what fabric was bought, in what quantities, at what price, from which merchants, for what occasions. These records are a historian's treasure because they let us see exactly what the medieval aristocracy spent on clothing and what they got for their money. And what they spent was extraordinary. The English royal accounts from the 14th century record purchases of dozens of yards of the finest scarlet cloth, of silk from Italy, of fur from Russia, via trade routes through the Baltic, of embroidery work from London's best workshops, of gold and silver thread, of fine leather and precious buttons. For major occasions, coronations, royal weddings, great feasts, diplomatic receptions, new wardrobes were commissioned wholesale. And this is important. Major events required entirely new clothing, not wearing something again that you'd worn before, not adapting last season's tunic, new. The medieval aristocracy, at the highest levels, practiced a form of conspicuous consumption that made modern fast fashion look restrained by comparison, not in terms of sheer quantity, but in terms of the deliberate, visible, socially performed nature of the expenditure. For a great royal feast or celebration, the entire household, not just the king and queen, but all the lords, all the ladies, all the knights, all the senior servants, might be issued matching livery in the royal colors. Hundreds of people, all dressed in coordinated cloth provided at royal expense, forming a living visual statement of royal power and generosity. The capacity to clothe your entire court was itself a demonstration of wealth. Let's get specific about what the nobility actually wore, because the details are genuinely remarkable. For men of high nobility in the 14th and 15th centuries, the fashionable silhouette followed the trends we discussed with knights, fitted, short, emphasizing the body, but with additional elaborations that only great wealth could support. The doublet, a padded fitted upper garment, became increasingly shaped, sometimes with a raised chest and pointed waist that created an almost sculpted effect. The hose became increasingly elaborate, sometimes party-colored, with each leg in a different color, or even different patterns, a striking visual effect that required good tailoring and good cloth to pull off. The houppelande, a large voluminous outer robe with wide sleeves and a high collar, was fashionable from the late 14th century, and could be, in its most elaborate versions, an extraordinary garment made of the finest patterned silk, lined with fur, with sleeves so wide they swept the floor, with edges cut into elaborate decorative shapes called dagging. Dagging deserves a moment of appreciation. It's the practice of cutting the edges of fabric, hems, sleeve edges, the edges of hoods, into decorative shapes, pointed scallops, leaf shapes, irregular tabs. It serves no functional purpose. It's pure ornament, and it required skilled cutting, and often additional fabric specifically to be cut away. Dagging was fashion for the sake of fashion. Beautiful for no reason other than that it was beautiful. The nobility of the later medieval period loved it, and it appeared on every possible garment edge. The noble woman's wardrobe was, in its own way, equally extraordinary, and in some periods, more fashion-forward and more visually adventurous than the men's. The fitted silhouette arrived in women's fashion somewhat later than in men's, but when it came with commitment. By the late 14th century, noble women's gowns were cut closely to the body through the chest and upper body, with a long, full skirt below. The first version of what would become the characteristic hourglass silhouette of Western women's fashion for the next several centuries. The décolletage neckline was sometimes cut quite low, which provoked predictable commentary from the church, and sometimes quite high, which provoked no commentary but was less fashionable. Sleeves were an area of particular creativity and sometimes extreme elaboration. By the 14th and 15th centuries, fashionable women's gowns might have extraordinarily long sleeves that trailed to the floor, or elaborately fitted sleeves with additional decorative elements at the cuff. The V-shaped neckline of the fitted gown might be filled in with a decorative panel of different fabric. The belt, now worn at the natural waist, or just below, might be an elaborate goldsmith's work of gilded metal links. And then there was the headwear. Oh, the headwear. Medieval aristocratic women's headwear is one of the most genuinely creative and occasionally alarming chapters in fashion history. For most of the earlier medieval period, noble women wore relatively restrained head coverings, veils, wimples, simple cloth arrangements that covered the hair. Then, beginning in the late 14th century and accelerating through the 15th, something happened. The hennin, that tall, cone-shaped hat that is almost universally what people think of when they imagine a medieval princess, is actually a fairly late and quite specific fashion, popular primarily in France and Burgundy in the mid to late 15th century. A full-length hennin could reach astonishing heights, 2 feet, 3 feet, more in extreme examples, sometimes trailing a veil from the tip. There were variations: the truncated hennin with a flat top, the two-horned butterfly hennin with fabric spread on a wire frame on either side of the head, the heart-shaped arrangement, the elaborate structured arrangements that required internal wire frameworks to maintain their shape. These headwear constructions were not just fashion eccentricity, they were engineering. The stiffened fabric, the wire supports, the complex veiling, producing and maintaining them required skill and materials. Wearing them required practice and, in extreme cases, architectural awareness of door frames. They raised the height of the wearer, literally elevating her above the general population, adding physical stature to social stature. They also required bare foreheads. The higher the headwear, the more forehead had to be exposed to balance the proportions, which led to the fashion for removing or shaving the hairline to create an artificially high forehead. Contemporary portraits show women with hairlines beginning well back on the skull, foreheads that gleam in the candlelight, the elaborate structure of the hennin rising above them. By our standards, it looks somewhat peculiar. By 15th century Burgundian courtly standards, it was the height of sophistication. The Burgundian court, incidentally, deserves special mention as one of the most fashion-obsessed courts in all of medieval Europe. The Duchy of Burgundy, which at its height controlled not just the French province of Burgundy, but also the wealthy textile-producing regions of Flanders, was, in the 15th century, one of the richest entities in Europe. The Dukes of Burgundy, particularly Philip the Good, and Charles the Bold, were extraordinarily lavish spenders on court display, and their courts set the fashion standard for much of northwestern Europe. The Burgundian court also gave us one of the most interesting fashion moments of the medieval period, the adoption of black as a prestige color. Philip the Good began wearing black as a kind of personal signature, reportedly as mourning for his father, who had been assassinated, and the color, already prestigious because of the difficulty and expense of producing a truly good black dye, became associated with Burgundian court fashion and spread from there. By the later 15th century, black was a fashionable and prestigious color for wealthy men across much of Europe, which is why so many Flemish merchant portraits show their subjects in black, not because they were mourning or somber, but because black was expensive, sophisticated, and fashionable. Royal coronation robes and the formal vestments of rulership were the most extraordinary garments in medieval Europe, a category unto themselves, so laden with symbolism and expense that they essentially functioned as wearable crowns. The English coronation vestments included robes deliberately modeled on episcopal vestments, anointing the king with holy oil. Vesting him in ceremonial robes was a religious ceremony that visually allied kingship with priesthood. The king's coronation regalia, the crown, the robes, the orb, the scepter, was not just clothing, but a visible argument about the nature of royal power. The use of fur in noble and royal dress was one of the most elaborate and carefully calibrated systems in all of medieval fashion. Different furs were assigned to different ranks, and the assignments were, by the later medieval period, quite precise. Ermine, again, the white winter stoat, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Miniver, white squirrel belly fur, was for the upper nobility. Gris, gray squirrel back fur, was for senior nobility and wealthy gentry. Rabbit and lamb were more broadly available. Fox fur was used, particularly for linings, at various social levels. Lynx, bear, marten, beaver. Each had its place in the fur hierarchy. Fur from more exotic or distant sources was especially prestigious because the distance implied difficulty of acquisition, which implied expense, which implied power. Russian sable, incredibly soft, incredibly dark, was the most prestigious fur available in medieval Europe, reserved for royalty and the most powerful nobles. Getting sable to Western Europe required traversing the fur trading networks of the Baltic and Hanseatic merchants, adding significant cost at every stage of the journey. The quantity of fur used in a garment was also meaningful. A modest fur trim on a cloak collar was respectable. A full fur lining of an entire robe, particularly an ermine lining with the characteristic spotted pattern of alternating white and black, was a declaration of power. The great portraits of medieval kings and nobles show robes where the lining visible at the hem, cuffs, and collar suggests that the entire interior of the garment, invisible when closed, is fur, a private luxury that could be glimpsed on the exterior. This was conspicuous consumption at its most elegant, the visible hint at invisible excess. And then there were the jewels. Jewelry in the medieval aristocracy was not decorative in the modern sense. It was currency, political communication, religious devotion, and personal identity all at once. The great lords and ladies of medieval Europe wore jewels of extraordinary quality, not just on their fingers and around their necks, but worked directly into their clothing. Jeweled buttons, jeweled belt clasps, jeweled circlets worn in the hair, small brooches of goldsmith work. The sisum brooch, in the medieval sense, could be an elaborate composition of gold, enamel, and gemstones, sometimes incorporating a personal motto or a religious image. Gifts of jewelry between rulers were diplomatic acts. The presentation of jeweled garments to favored courtiers was a political statement of favor. The wearing of a particular jewel could signal political allegiance. During the English Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, wearing white roses or red roses, wearing badges of the House of Lancaster or York, was a declaration of faction and allegiance that could, in the wrong circumstances, get you killed. Clothing at the highest levels of medieval society was, in the end, completely inseparable from politics. Every great noble household was a political entity, and its visual display, the clothing of its lord and lady, the livery of its servants, the heraldic decorations of its buildings and equipment, was a continuous performance of power and identity. The great feasts and ceremonies of the medieval calendar were opportunities for this display to be maximized. Every important lord appearing in his best clothing, every lady in her finest jewels, the whole assembly a carefully orchestrated visual demonstration of the social order. Which brings us finally to a question that's been lurking beneath the surface of everything we've discussed so far. What did it feel like to live inside all of this? What was the human experience of medieval clothing? Not the politics of it, not the economics of it, but the actual physical daily experience of wearing these things. That question will take us into our final sections, where we look at how clothing changed with the seasons, how it was cared for, what happened to it when it wore out, and how the people wearing it actually felt about what they were wearing. But that, as they say, is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 7, Wearing It, the daily experience of medieval clothing. You've seen the clothes. You've met the people wearing them. You understand, at least in broad terms, why they wore what they wore, the economics, the theology, the politics, the social signaling. Now let's do something that fashion history books often skip over in their rush to get to the interesting garments and the illuminated manuscripts. Let's actually put the clothes on. Let's talk about what it was like, physically, practically, daily, to live inside medieval clothing, because there's a version of medieval fashion history that's all about the beautiful artifacts, the stunning tapestries, the jeweled accessories, and the elegant courtly silhouettes. And that version is real and true and genuinely exciting. But there's another version that involves itching and cold feet, and the particular challenge of going to the bathroom when you're wearing a complicated set of layered wool garments in a world without elastic waistbands. And that version is also real and true and probably more relevant to the daily experience of the overwhelming majority of people who actually wore these things. Let's start with the morning, because morning is where clothing begins. You wake up. Regardless of who you are, peasant, merchant, monk, or queen, the first thing that happens is that you are cold. Medieval buildings were cold. Medieval bedrooms were cold. The fire that had been carefully banked for the night had died down or gone out entirely, and the stone walls of even a prosperous house are not good insulation. Rich people had bed curtains specifically to trap body heat. Very rich people had actual fireplaces in their bedrooms. The very richest people had servants whose job was to warm the bed with heated stones before they got into it. Everyone else woke up cold, which meant that getting dressed was not a leisurely process of standing in front of an imaginary wardrobe contemplating options. It was, for most people most of the time, a fairly urgent process of getting cloth between your skin and the cold air. For a peasant, this was straightforward because there were almost no options. You slept most likely in your linen undergarments, the chemise or shirt, or in some cases in a rough nightshirt that was a version of the same thing. You got up, added your wool tunic and hose, pulled on your shoes, fastened your belt, and you were dressed. The whole process might take 5 minutes. There was no separate getting dressed wardrobe. Your clothes lived in a chest or on a peg, and there were few enough of them that finding them was not complicated. For a wealthy noblewoman, dressing was an entirely different proposition. An elaborate, social ritualized process that required assistance and took significant time. The chemise went on first, then the stockings and garters, then the fitted gown, which laced up the back or side, and therefore absolutely required another person to fasten it properly. Then the belt, the headdress, which, as we've established, could be an engineering project in itself. Then the jewelry, then the shoes. A great lady's chamber had ladies in waiting, whose primary job was to assist with exactly this process. Getting dressed was not something you did alone. It was something done to you by people whose social position was defined in part by their access to your body in this intimate moment. The same was true for a great lord, who had attendants to help him dress, to hold garments while he put his arms through, to fasten points and laces, to arrange the folds of an outer robe. The ceremony of the royal levee, the getting up of the king, conducted in the presence of his closest noble attendants, was one of the most politically significant daily rituals of a medieval royal court, precisely because proximity to the king's body during dressing was a privilege that defined the inner circle of power. Now let's talk about something that people often wonder about. When they think about medieval clothing and that the illuminated manuscripts conspicuously don't address hygiene and smell, the received wisdom that medieval people never washed, smelled perpetually terrible, and had no concept of personal cleanliness is an oversimplification, though not entirely without basis. The reality is more complicated and considerably more interesting. Medieval people did wash. They washed their faces and hands regularly because these were the parts of the body most visible and most subject to social judgment. Public bathhouses, stews, or bagnios were present in most medieval cities of any size and were used regularly by a significant portion of the urban population. Private bathing was practiced by those wealthy enough to have facilities. Large wooden tubs filled with heated water by servants, sometimes with herbs or other fragrant additions, in which wealthy individuals bathed with reasonable regularity. Medieval medical literature explicitly recommended regular bathing as beneficial to health. The church had some anxieties about the moral dangers of bathhouses. They did sometimes double as brothels, which the church found predictable and irritating, but it did not actually oppose washing in principle. The issue was practicality. Heating enough water to fill a bath, in a world where water was hauled by hand and fire was the only heat source, was genuinely labor-intensive. For ordinary people, a full immersion bath was an occasional luxury, not a daily routine. Partial washing, face, hands, feet, specific other body parts, was more frequent. Clothing was part of the hygiene system in a way that's interesting to think about. The linen undergarments, the chemise and shirt worn directly against the skin, were the layer that absorbed the body's sweat, oil, and other products. These were washed more frequently than outer garments, not daily. Laundry in a world without running water, detergent, washing machines, or tumble dryers was enormously labor-intensive, but regularly by medieval standards. The word laundering comes from the Latin for linen, and the laundering of linen was a specific, important skilled task. Outer wool garments were washed rarely or not at all. Wool, if washed incorrectly or too frequently, felts and shrinks, which is not a desirable outcome for a garment you've paid a significant amount to have made. Wool was spot cleaned where necessary and aired out regularly. Hanging clothing outside in fresh air to ventilate was a common practice. Fragrancing clothing with dried herbs, sachets of aromatic plants, or fragrant wood was practiced by those who could afford the herbs. Cedar and other aromatic woods were used in storage chests, not just to deter moths, a real and constant problem, but to transfer a pleasant scent to the stored clothing. But let's be direct about this. A medieval great hall at a winter feast packed with hundreds of people who had been wearing wool garments for weeks without washing them, whose hair was styled with animal fat-based products, who were eating large quantities of meat and drinking significant amounts of ale, and who had traveled to the event through winter mud, smelled. It smelled in ways that we would find quite challenging. This was simply a reality of medieval life, and people adjusted their expectations accordingly. The olfactory world of the Middle Ages was different from ours in almost every dimension, stronger, more varied, and considerably less filtered. The practical challenges of medieval clothing don't stop at smell. Let's talk about movement, because the way medieval garments moved, or didn't, with the body was central to the daily experience of wearing them. For working people, the priority was freedom of movement, and peasant clothing was designed with this in mind. The loose tunic, the belted waist, the hose that stretched somewhat on the bias, all of these allowed the bending, lifting, reaching, and sustained physical labor that a peasant's day required. Work clothing was practical, not stylish, and it was often belted up shorter than its natural length during active work, tucking the hem into the belt to keep it out of the way. For fashionable people wearing more elaborate garments, the relationship between clothing and movement was more fraught. The extremely long trains of fashionable women's gowns in the later medieval period were, functionally, a spectacular inconvenience. They were designed to be worn at court, walking slowly and deliberately in formal spaces where servants were available to carry the train. In any other context, going upstairs, walking through a crowded market, sitting down at a feast, the train was actively in the way. This was, of course, also the point. Clothing that required servants to manage was clothing that demonstrated you had servants. The elaborate headwear we've discussed had similar, known characteristics. You could not wear a 2-foot hennin in a low-ceiling room. You could not wear it in the rain. You could not wear it while doing anything that required you to move quickly. It was clothing for stillness, for display, for the specific context of the great hall or the formal garden. Contexts available only to those sufficiently wealthy and leisured to inhabit them. The practical reality of armor deserves mention here too, because the popular image of knights being unable to move in full plate armor is itself a kind of myth that needs correction. A well-fitted suit of plate armor, fitted specifically to its wearer by a skilled armorer, allowed more movement than most people imagine. Knights trained in armor from youth, building the strength and coordination to move, fight, mount, and dismount, and function in what was essentially a steel shell. Videos of people doing cartwheels and jumping onto horses in full-plate armor are widely available, and broadly, accurate demonstrations of what a fit trained person could actually do. What plate armor was genuinely terrible for was heat. Metal in summer sun or during intense physical exertion becomes a genuine thermal hazard. Medieval sources describe knights becoming dangerously overheated during battle, which is as uncomfortable as it sounds. Cooling strategies were limited, there's only so much you can do, and dying from heat exhaustion in armor was a real possibility. Cold had its own set of problems. Metal in winter is approximately as pleasant to wear as you'd expect, which is why the padded arming doublet worn beneath was so essential, and why additional layers of wool stuffed into various parts of the armor were sometimes employed as insulation. Knights on winter campaigns, and there were many winter campaigns because wars didn't always pause neatly for the seasons, were cold in ways that physical historians who have experimented with period-accurate armor describe as quite unpleasant. The experience of wearing wool in wet weather was another daily reality for much of the population most of the time. Wool, famously, retains some insulating properties even when wet. The lanolin in the fiber provides some natural water resistance, and the fiber's crimp traps air even when damp. This is genuinely useful in cold, wet climates like England or northern France, and it's one reason why wool dominated northern European clothing, rather than, say, cotton or linen outer garments, but retains some insulating properties when wet, is not the same as keeps you dry. And a medieval worker, caught in the rain, was going to be wearing wet wool for the rest of the day. And it was going to smell like wet wool, which is a distinctive experience. Shoes were a particular vulnerability. As mentioned earlier, medieval shoes were not waterproof by modern standards. Turn shoe construction and the leather available in the medieval period simply did not create an impermeable barrier. Wet feet were common. Wet feet in cold weather, worn day after day, led to chilblains, painful inflammations of the small blood vessels in the extremities, which are referenced repeatedly in medieval medical literature as a common complaint of the lower classes. Pattens, wooden platform sandals worn over regular shoes to raise the foot above the muddy street, were widely used in towns precisely because wet feet were such a constant problem. The lice problem deserves a mention because it was real and widespread and deeply woven into the fabric, quite literally, of medieval clothing. Body lice and head lice were endemic in the medieval period across all social classes. Even queens were not immune. There are accounts of lice being found in royal clothing. The NIT comb, used to remove lice and their eggs from hair, was a standard piece of personal equipment. The washing of linen undergarments was partly motivated by the desire to remove lice, which lived in clothing seams as well as in hair. Flea infestation of bedding and clothing was similarly universal. This sounds grim, and it was, but it's worth putting in context. The medieval world did not know what caused disease. The germ theory of disease is a 19th century development, but it did know that parasites were unpleasant and attempted to control them through various means. Herbal repellents were used. Clothing was aired and sometimes smoked over aromatic fires. Regular combing of hair was recommended by medical authorities. The battle against parasites was constant and largely unsuccessful, but it was fought. Seasonal variation in clothing is another dimension of the daily experience that's worth dwelling on. Medieval people dressed differently in summer and winter, not by opening a different section of the wardrobe and switching between warm weather and cold weather clothes in the modern sense, but by adding or removing layers. Winter meant more layers, heavier cloth, furs, and lined garments for those who could afford them, and extra wrapping around extremities, thick wool hose, perhaps 2 pairs of socks, 1 linen, 1 wool, heavier cloaks. Cold medieval winters in northern Europe were genuinely cold. The period roughly 1300 to 1850 is sometimes called the Little Ice Age, characterized by lower average temperatures than the preceding centuries, and winters in medieval England or France or Germany could be severe by any standard. Summer meant fewer layers, lighter fabrics, shorter sleeves if fashion permitted, and a shift from wool outerwear to lighter wool, or, for those who could afford it, linen outer garments. Linen's cooling properties made it desirable in heat. Heat, in the context of indoor cooking fires and physical labor, was a genuine problem, especially in the hotter months. The great halls of castles could be stifling in summer. Stone walls that helped retain warmth in winter also retained heat when the weather turned. The care and maintenance of clothing consumed significant daily time and effort in medieval households. Garments were brushed, aired, refolded, and stored carefully. Moths, the great enemy of wool, were combated with aromatic plants. Lavender, rosemary, cedar, rue, and wormwood were all used to line chests and discourage moth larvae. Stains were treated promptly with various substances. Urine, a mild detergent by virtue of its ammonia content. Breadcrumbs rubbed into grease stains, various plant-based cleaning agents. Tears were mended, worn areas were patched. The fraying edges of garments were repaired. When a garment was beyond repair, it was not thrown away. It was repurposed. The rich gave garments to servants or to the poor. This was considered an act of charity and was specifically mentioned in many wills. The garment then moved down the social ladder, being adapted or worn as is by its new owner. Further down the line, too worn to be worn at all, the cloth became rags used for cleaning, for patching other garments, for bedding. Below that, rags became the raw material for paper. Medieval paper was made from linen and cotton rags, which meant that the old undergarment of a peasant woman might, at the end of its life, be transformed into paper and then into a manuscript page. The material life cycle of medieval cloth was genuinely circular in a way that makes modern recycling look primitive. The experience of sleeping in medieval clothing adds another dimension. For most people, there was no separate sleepwear. You slept in your undergarments, the linen chemise or shirt. Wealthier people might have dedicated sleeping garments, but the concept of entirely separate clothing for sleeping was not universal. In cold weather, you kept more on. Men sleeping rough, soldiers on campaign, travelers without accommodation, slept in most of their clothing, using their cloaks as blankets. The intimacy of the shared bed. Beds were often shared between multiple people who might not be related. It was not considered strange for strangers at an inn to share a bed. Meant that whatever you were wearing to sleep was visible to anyone sharing your sleeping space. The emotional and psychological dimension of clothing is harder to access across the centuries. but it's present in the historical record if you look for it. Medieval people wrote about clothes in poems, in romances, in religious texts, in practical documents like wills and inventories. They gave garments as gifts and received them as gifts. They wore garments as love tokens. They kept garments belonging to dead people as memorial objects. The great nobles and royals, who are depicted in effigy on their tombs, are usually shown in their finest clothing because the clothing was part of how they wished to be remembered. Gift-giving of clothing between social unequals was a carefully managed social ritual. A lord who gave his knight a fine robe was communicating favor and generosity. The knight who received it wore it as a visible sign of that favor. A king who gave matching robes to all his senior courtiers was performing royal generosity at scale, transforming his court into a visual demonstration of his wealth and largesse. The receipt of livery clothing from a great lord was a form of entering his household and his service. The servant who wore his lord's colors was publicly identifying himself as belonging to that lord's power structure. Even the most intimate decisions about clothing had social and emotional weight. A widow who wore black or undyed cloth as mourning was making a public statement about grief that the community read and responded to. A man who appeared at church in his best garments on a saint's day was participating in a community ritual of celebration. The clothes were never just clothes, which leads us naturally to the question of what the clothes meant, not just in terms of social status, but in terms of the symbolic and cultural meanings that medieval people attached to specific colors, specific materials, specific garments. Because the medieval mind was intensely symbolic, and clothing was one of the primary ways that symbolism was made visible in the world. Chapter 8: Color, Symbol, and the Meaning of What You Wore. Let's play a quick game. I'm going to describe a color, and you're going to tell me what you associate with it. Ready? White. If you said purity, innocence, cleanliness, brides, weddings, you're sharing an association that goes back through Western European culture, at least to the medieval period, and in many cases further. The white linen of the priest's awl, the white habit of the Cistercian monk, the white wedding dress of the noble bride. White meant purity, which meant spiritual cleanliness, which meant the absence of sin. But white in the medieval world was also complicated. Achieving truly white cloth required significant effort. Sun-bleaching linen on the grass for weeks was a labor-intensive process, and the whiteness of your linen was a visible marker of the work or the purchased labor invested in your appearance. The medieval woman of means, whose white chemise showed pristinely at her cuffs, was signaling not just purity, but prosperity. Real white, lasting white, was expensive white, and white had some less positive associations too. White was also the color of lepers' robes in some regions. The pale, washed-out whiteness of undyed linen connected in some cultural contexts to the pallor of disease and death. The same color that meant purity in one context meant contamination in another. Medieval color symbolism was rarely simple. Red, as we've established, was the color of power and wealth in the medieval world. The expensive kermes dye, the rich scarlet wool, the crimson silk of the king's robe. Red communicated authority, importance, the capacity to spend. Red was also the color of martyr's blood in religious iconography, making it appropriate for the vestments worn on martyrs' feast days. Red could mean both worldly power and sacred sacrifice, and the tension between those meanings was considered theologically productive rather than contradictory. Red had another dimension. It was the color of strong emotion, of passion, of the kind of intensity that could be positive or dangerous. The red robes of a judge in some medieval traditions connected the color to severity and the shedding of blood in the execution of justice. The red of the devil in medieval religious drama connected it to hellfire and sin. The same color worn in a royal court, a cathedral, and a mystery play did different symbolic work in each context. And a medieval audience would have been sensitive to those distinctions in a way that we, navigating a much less color-coded world, probably wouldn't be. Blue underwent one of the most interesting color transformations of the medieval period. In the early medieval world, blue was not particularly prestigious. It was producible from woad at relatively modest cost, and it was widely worn. But then something happened to blue in the 12th century. It became the color of the Virgin Mary. This was not inevitable. Earlier depictions of the Virgin had used various colors for her robes, but as Marian devotion became increasingly central to medieval Christianity, the cult of the Virgin is one of the defining features of 12th and 13th century religious culture. Her visual representation became increasingly standardized, and blue became her color. A deep, rich, saturated blue, often produced by combining woad with more expensive indigo for greater depth and stability. The theological reasons for the association were worked out after the fact. Blue for the sky, for heaven, for royalty, for constancy and truth. But the practical effect was that blue, associated with the most venerated female figure in Christendom, acquired a prestige and a positive symbolic charge that it hadn't previously had. By the 13th and 14th centuries, blue was being worn by kings. The kings of France made blue a specifically royal color, pairing it with gold, and this royal blue association persisted for centuries. The French fleur-de-lis on a blue ground became one of the most recognizable heraldic images in Europe. Green was trickier. Green was associated with nature, with spring, with the freshness of new growth. All generally positive associations. But green was also associated with youth, inconstancy, and naivety, the greenness of inexperience. In some contexts, green was associated with fairies and the supernatural world, which was ambiguous. Fairies in the medieval imagination were not the friendly creatures of children's stories, but powerful, unpredictable forces that could be dangerous. Green, in certain folklore contexts, was a warning as much as a celebration. Green was also, in some regions, and some periods, a color associated with prostitutes or women of low morality, possibly because of its associations with the natural, unconstrained world outside social order. The prostitute wearing green was, in this symbolic reading, a woman who had stepped outside the proper social structures that defined respectable femininity. Whether individual women wearing green were aware of or concerned about these associations varied enormously by context. Yellow had its own complicated trajectory. Gold, the idealized version of yellow, was of course the color of divine light, of the sun, of the most precious metal, of heavenly glory. Yellow gold in religious art meant holiness. The halos of saints were gold. The gates of heaven were gold. God's presence was associated with golden light. Gold thread, investments, and noble garments captured this sacred association. But regular yellow, the dye color produced cheaply from weld or other plant sources, was sometimes associated with cowardice, with deceit, with those considered outside the social order. In some medieval cities, Jews were required to wear yellow badges or yellow-colored garments as identifying marks, an association that placed yellow in the category of stigmatizing colors, alongside the markers worn by lepers and prostitutes. Black, as we've discussed, was expensive and prestigious when done well, but it also carried its obvious associations with death, mourning, the absence of light. In religious contexts, black was the color of penance and humility. The Benedictines wore it as a color of solemnity and discipline. In secular contexts, its associations were more varied. By the later medieval period, the expensive, well-dyed black of Flemish merchant portraits and Burgundian court fashion had successfully separated black as sophisticated luxury from black as death, at least in fashionable circles. The problem with simple color symbolism is that medieval people were fully aware that the same color could mean different things in different contexts, and they navigated those differences with considerable sophistication. A theologian writing about color symbolism investments was working in a different framework from a herald describing colors in coats of arms, who was working in a different framework from a poet describing a lady's gown, who was working in a different framework from the actual woman choosing what to wear to a feast. Beyond color, the materials themselves carried symbolic weight. Silk, as we've discussed, was luxury, but it was also, because of its associations with Byzantium and the Islamic world, with the Orient, with the exotic and the strange. Something that carried a kind of glamour beyond mere expense. The great silk textiles of the medieval period, the Byzantine and Islamic lampas and brocades with their repeating patterns of animals, trees, and geometric designs, were objects of genuine wonder in Western Europe. When they appeared, in wills or inventories, scribes often described them with evident admiration. Fur carried a particularly rich symbolic charge. Beyond the purely social signaling function of fur, ermine means royalty, martin means prosperity, and so on. Fur was associated with the animal kingdom, with hunting, with the natural world. The great lords who wore fur were simultaneously displaying wealth and connecting themselves visually to the aristocratic culture of the hunt. Hunting was not just a leisure activity for the medieval nobility. It was a social ritual that reinforced hierarchical relationships, a training ground for military skills, and a symbolic assertion of noble dominion over the natural world. The fur on a lord's robe was a reminder of that dominion. Gold and silver embroidery and metallic thread was a real category of medieval textile decoration, using actual strips of gold or silver or silk thread wrapped around a metal core. Communicated the sacred and the precious simultaneously. The same gold thread that decorated the vestments of a bishop also decorated the gowns of a queen. The visual language of religious and secular authority were, in the medieval world, deeply intertwined, because the authority of kings and nobles was itself understood as deriving from God. The symbolism of specific garments, as opposed to the materials they were made of, was equally rich. The belt was a loaded symbol in multiple registers. Girding yourself, putting on a belt, was associated with preparation for action, for readiness. The phrase, "gird your loins," from the Bible, meant preparing yourself mentally and spiritually. The belting of a knight during the dubbing ceremony, the ceremonial fastening of a sword belt as part of the ritual of knighting, was a symbolically charged moment. Conversely, the removal of a belt, the deliberate ungirding, was associated with defeat, submission, and penitence. The hood was another symbolically significant garment. Hoods covered the head, and the head was associated with reason, with dignity, with the upper reaches of a person that were closest to heaven and furthest from the earth. Covering the head in certain contexts was a sign of respect or submission. Men removing hats before the king or before the altar. Covering the head in other contexts was a sign of modesty or mourning. The hood pulled up over the face, the hooded figure, was associated in medieval visual culture with mystery, with humility, with the liminal figure of the pilgrim or the penitent. Gloves were another garment with elaborate symbolic associations. The throwing of a glove was a challenge. Throwing a glove at someone's feet or in their face was a demand for combat or for satisfaction, the physical gesture that initiated a formal duel or judicial combat. The presentation of a glove was a grant of authority. A lord investing someone with land or office might present a glove as the physical symbol of that transfer. In religious contexts, episcopal gloves were a formal part of the bishop's vestments, worn during the Mass with their own symbolic loading. The shoe, particularly in its extreme pointed form, was a symbol of status and, in a broader cultural context, of masculine sexual confidence. The pointed poulain was not just impractical, it was, in the frank assessment of most modern scholars who have written about it, also phallic, and this was probably not accidental. Medieval culture was considerably more comfortable with this kind of visual double meaning than some modern discussions of it acknowledge. The caricature of pointed medieval shoes in modern media tends to emphasize their absurdity, but they were also a deliberate statement about the virility and potency of the man wearing them, an association that made them appealing to young noblemen in ways that purely rational fashion analysis doesn't capture. Religious significance permeated medieval dress at every level. The donning of pilgrims' clothing, the rough robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the staff, the scrip, a small bag for provisions, was a transformation of identity, a visible statement that you had stepped out of your everyday social role and taken on the liminal identity of the traveler toward the sacred. Pilgrims were, in theory, protected by their pilgrim status. Harming a pilgrim on the road was a religious as well as a civil offense. The pilgrim's clothing was a kind of sacred badge that announced this protected status. Similarly, the clothing of the crusader, the red cross sewn onto the surcoat, the distinctive uniform of the different military orders like the Templars, white mantles with red crosses, and the Hospitallers, black mantles with white crosses, was simultaneously military uniform, religious habit, and political statement. Taking the cross, the formal ceremony of joining a crusade, involved receiving a cloth cross that was sewn onto the garment. A physical transformation of the wearer's identity and an external sign of the internal vow. The cross on a crusader's garment connected the wearer to Christ's sacrifice in a direct visual way. It was also a target in battle, making it immediately clear who the enemy was looking at. Sacred and practical, as always, coexisted in medieval clothing. The wearing of relics and protective objects associated with clothing is another dimension worth mentioning. Relics of saints, small pieces of bone, fragments of cloth associated with holy persons, other sacred objects, were widely carried and sometimes incorporated into clothing or accessories. Small pouches worn under clothing might contain relics. The Agnus Dei, a small wax disc impressed with the image of a lamb and blessed by the Pope, was worn as a protective amulet. Rings with particular stones were worn for their believed protective or medicinal properties, drawing on a long tradition of lapidary lore that assigned specific virtues to specific gemstones. This interweaving of the religious and the protective was not superstition in any simple sense. It was a coherent worldview in which the material and the spiritual were continuous rather than separate, in which blessed objects genuinely carried divine power, and in which clothing the body carefully in materials with the right properties was a form of spiritual as well as physical self-protection. The medieval world was, in short, a world saturated with symbolic meaning, and clothing was one of the primary ways that meaning was made visible. To dress carefully, to choose the right color, the right fabric, the right garments for the right occasion, was to participate in a vast, shared symbolic language that everyone around you was also reading. The literacy of that language varied by class and education, but its existence was universal, and that language changed. Which brings us to our final chapter before the conclusion, the question of how medieval dress evolved over the roughly 1,000 years we've been discussing, and what drove those changes. Chapter 9. Fashion crashes and the crash of fashion. How medieval dress changed over time. We've been talking about medieval clothing somewhat as though it was a static thing, as though what someone wore in 1050 and what someone wore in 1450 were broadly comparable, different in detail, but similar in kind. This is, in one sense, true. The basic vocabulary of tunic, hose, cloak, belt, and shoe persists across the whole period, and the social logic governing what different classes wore remained fundamentally similar throughout. But in another sense, medieval fashion changed enormously, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling abruptness, and understanding why it changed tells us things about medieval society that go well beyond clothing. Let's start at the beginning of our period. The early medieval world, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, was a world recovering from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Roman trade networks had largely dissolved, urban populations had shrunk dramatically, and the sophisticated luxury economy that had supplied the Roman world with silk, exotic dyes, and elaborate textile production had contracted. Clothing in this period was, broadly, simpler than it would later become. Not because early medieval people were less creative or less interested in appearance, but because the resources and the trade networks to support elaborate clothing were more limited. What survived from Roman tradition was primarily the basic silhouette, the tunic, the cloak, the belt, adapted and modified by the various Germanic peoples who had settled across the former Roman territories. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, each had their own textile traditions, their own preferences for color and ornament, their own methods of fastening garments. The penannular brooch, a circular or near-circular pin for fastening cloaks, was widely used across northern Europe and became an art object in its own right, sometimes decorated with extraordinary interlaced patterns. Anglo-Saxon embroidery, even in this early period, was renowned for its quality. The Viking world added its own distinctive textile traditions, and Viking Age textiles recovered from graves and waterlogged sites across Scandinavia show considerable sophistication. Tablet-woven braids, produced on a series of small square or rectangular tablets through which the thread was passed in controlled sequences, producing complex geometric patterns. Used as trim on garments, silk imported from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds via trade routes through Russia. Careful attention to the quality and preparation of wool and linen. The period from roughly 1000 to 1200 saw significant changes in European society and in European dress. The agricultural revolution of the High Middle Ages produced greater food, surpluses, and supported growing populations. Trade networks expanded, cities grew. The Crusades opened new contact with the Islamic world and with Byzantium, bringing back not just material goods, but knowledge of techniques and an expanded awareness of what was possible in textiles and dress. The Romanesque period in art and architecture, roughly the 11th and 12th centuries, was characterized by a taste for rich ornament, for color, for the kind of decorative elaboration visible in the manuscript paintings of the period. Clothing of this period, as far as we can reconstruct it, reflected this taste. Rich embroidery at hems and cuffs, the increasing use of decorated braids and borders, the display of expensive cloth in quantity rather than in fitted cut. The silhouette was still relatively loose. The garment still tended to be cut simply and to hang from the body rather than follow its contours. Then came the Gothic period, roughly the 13th through 15th centuries, and it was during this period that the most dramatic and visible changes in medieval dress occurred. The Gothic period in dress is characterized by increasing complexity of cut, increasing attention to the fit and shape of garments, and an accelerating pace of fashion change that by the 14th century had produced something recognizable as a fashion industry in the modern sense. The key development was tailoring, specifically the gradual working out of techniques for cutting and assembling cloth in 3 dimensions so that it conformed to the body rather than merely draped over it. This sounds simple, but it was genuinely not. Cutting cloth on the bias, diagonally to the weave, allowed it to stretch and conform. Curved seams allowed shapes that straight seams could not produce. Gores, triangular or wedge-shaped pieces of fabric inserted into a garment, added fullness in specific places while maintaining fit elsewhere. Lacing and buttons allowed garments to be adjusted and tightened at specific points. These techniques did not appear from nowhere. They were worked out gradually by skilled tailors working in urban workshops, experimenting with cut and construction, learning from mistakes and from each other. The rise of the tailors' guilds, professional organizations of skilled garment cutters, distinct from weavers who produced cloth, and from seamstresses who sewed simple garments, in the cities of Northern Europe from the 13th century onward, was both a cause and a product of this increasing sophistication. And with the ability to fit garments to the body came the desire to do so, and the desire to change the silhouette as fashion dictated. Once you could cut a fitted garment, you could also decide that this season's fitted garment should have a higher waist than last season's, or a different neckline, or sleeves of a different shape. Fashion change, in the sense of deliberate annual or seasonal modification of what was considered stylish, became possible at a level it hadn't been before because the tool set for making those changes had expanded. The acceleration of fashion change in the 14th century was also connected to the Black Death, the pandemic that killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1352. This is a connection that might seem counterintuitive, but historians have noted that in the aftermath of the Black Death, European society was in many ways transformed, and one of those transformations touched on fashion. The massive mortality of the plague created a labor shortage that increased wages for surviving workers and craftspeople. It also created an inheritance windfall. Survivors inherited from relatives who had died, sometimes multiple times over. The net effect was that surviving members of the lower and middle classes had more money than before, and they spent some of that money on better food, better housing, and better clothing. This is precisely the period when sumptuary legislation began to be passed most aggressively. The laws of the 1360s and 1370s responding directly to the post-plague fashion inflation they were witnessing. The Black Death also had a more psychological effect on fashion. Facing mortality so directly and so universally created, in some segments of society, a kind of intensified appetite for life, pleasure, and display. The culture of carpe diem, seize the day, found expression partly in clothing, in a determination to dress well and display wealth while you were alive to display it. This is speculative as a historical argument, but there's something in the evidence for the period's fashion excess that suggests a society rattled by death expressing its continued vitality through conspicuous display. The 14th century also saw the emergence of what we might call the first recognizable fashion seasons, periods within the year when new styles were presented and adopted. This wasn't yet the organized fashion industry of later centuries with its shows and collections and media coverage, but the great courts of Europe, the French royal court above all, but also the English court and the Italian city-state courts, were beginning to function as style-setting centers, from which fashions radiated outward to the lesser nobility, and then more slowly to the merchant class. The fashion cycle was already, in the 14th and 15th centuries, functioning partly as a class maintenance tool. The nobility adopted new styles. The wealthy merchant class, with a lag of months or years, adopted the same styles. By the time the merchants were wearing a particular fashion, the nobility had moved on to something else. The constant movement of fashion served to maintain visual distance between the classes, even as economic mobility was shrinking the real gap between them. It was an escalator that kept moving, ensuring that the people at the bottom who were climbing toward the top never quite arrived. We should also talk about the Italian contribution to late medieval fashion, because it is substantial and somewhat underappreciated. The great Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Genoa, were not just the centers of Europe's banking and textile industries. They were also cultural innovators whose taste and creativity in dress was as influential as their economic power. Florentine fashion of the 14th and 15th centuries, preserved in portrait painting, in contemporary literature, and in the extraordinary records of households like the Dettini Merchant Archive, shows clothing of a sophistication and visual creativity that was genuinely at the leading edge of European fashion. The Italian innovation in silk production, the development of silk weaving in Lucca, and then Florence that we mentioned earlier, was central to this. Italian silk weavers produced brocades, velvets, and lampas textiles of extraordinary quality that became the prestige textiles of late medieval Europe, replacing the Byzantine and Islamic imports that had previously dominated the luxury market. Italian silk velvet, cut velvet, voided velvet, pile-on-pile velvet was the most prestigious textile in 15th century Europe, and it came from Florence and Venice and Genoa. The Italian merchant who sold you this fabric was also quite often wearing it. The end of our period, roughly 1450 to 1500, sees European dress in a state of extraordinary creativity and complexity. The Burgundian court's influence had spread fashionable excess across Northern Europe. Italian Renaissance thought was beginning to influence the way educated Europeans thought about the human body and its representation, which would eventually transform the aesthetics of dress in ways that moved it away from medieval conventions. Plate armor had reached its technical peak of sophistication before gunpowder rendered it obsolete. the sumptuary legislation that had been passed, ignored, revised, and passed again for 2 centuries, was increasingly understood to be a losing battle against the commercial forces that were making fashion democratized in ways that no legislation could entirely prevent. And printing, the development of the movable type printing press in the 1450s, was, within a few decades, beginning to make possible the wider circulation of images of fashionable dress, which would eventually lead to the fashion plate and the fashion magazine and the whole modern apparatus of fashion media. The medieval period of clothing history was ending, not with a clear break, but with a gradual transformation into something new. What remained constant across the whole 1,000 years was the basic human impulse to cover the body, to make that covering meaningful, to use it to communicate identity and status and aspiration, to find beauty in fabric and cut and color, and to engage in the eternal negotiation between what you're supposed to wear and what you actually want to wear. That negotiation is as old as clothing itself. And it is, needless to say, still ongoing. Conclusion: the stitch that holds you've made it. You've traveled from the scratchy linen of a peasant's chemise to the ermine-lined robes of a French king. You've passed through the workshops where wool was scoured and dyed, the tailoring shops where fitted doublets were cut on the bias, the convent workshops where opus Anglicanum was stitched by lamplight. You've stood in the tournament field and watched the heraldic display, sat in the cathedral and watched the vestmented clergy process, walked through the city and seen the merchants testing the limits of the sumptuary laws. And what does all of it add up to? Here's the honest answer. Clothing in the Middle Ages was a complete visual language, arguably the most complex, most widely read, and most socially consequential visual language in medieval Europe. In a world with very limited formal record-keeping, without identity documents, without photography, without the bureaucratic infrastructure of the modern state, what you wore was genuinely how you were known. It told the world what you were before you opened your mouth. It placed you in the social order with a precision that could be read instantly by anyone who spoke the visual language. And everyone did. But it was also simultaneously a site of constant contestation. The sumptuary laws were passed because people were violating the code. The sermons were preached because people were dressing above their station. The fashion cycles accelerated because people were using clothing to climb, to aspire, to refuse to stay neatly in the category their birth had assigned them. The merchants bought silk because they could afford it and they wanted it, and no amount of legislation about who was and wasn't allowed to wear silk fully stopped them. This is perhaps the thing that makes medieval clothing history feel so surprisingly alive and relevant. We tend to think of medieval society as static, fixed, hierarchical in ways that allowed no movement, and in many ways it was. But the clothing tells a different story, the story of a society in constant negotiation with itself about who got to wear what and what it meant, a negotiation that was never fully resolved, that was renewed every generation as new wealth challenged old birth, and new fashions challenged old conventions. The peasant who couldn't afford color, the monk who chose undyed wool to prove a point, the merchant's wife who wore silk trim and paid the fine cheerfully, the king who dressed in ermine and expected everyone in the room to feel the difference. They were all participating in the same conversation. The same, very long, very expensive, often ridiculous, occasionally breathtaking conversation about what it means to cover the human body and what that covering says about who we are. A conversation, it turns out, that we have never really stopped having